Looking back, I can't pinpoint when things shifted, but I know it was somewhere between the years and routines, buried under the ordinary days and quiet nights. I married Sam because he made me feel safe, like he'd wrapped the world around me and never let anything fall apart. In those first years, his steady presence felt like a gift. Now, nearly 2 decades later, that very constancy seemed to cage me. Everything was set in stone. Our home, our habits, our entire life. Sam had a solid job and worked long hours, pouring himself into work, and I found myself alone more often than I ever expected. But then came that night. I was on the porch with a glass of wine, swirling it slowly as dusk faded. I'd just been letting the stillness wash over me, wishing it could feel peaceful instead of hollow. The faint rumble of an engine broke the silence, followed by a chorus of laughter that felt wild and foreign. I looked up just in time to see a cluster of headlights coming down the street, loud engines and shadows riding like they own the night. Bikers. And as the lights flashed over our house, I realized something unexpected. I liked the sound of it, the way it interrupted everything. A few days after that, my son Matt called. He was coming home, he said. Money was tight and life in his little rented room wasn't working out. Matt was from my first marriage, from a life I'd left behind so long ago that having him back would be like opening an old book I hadn't read in years. I felt a mixture of relief and something close to dread, as if I were opening a door I'd carefully kept shut. Still, the thought of having him here filled me with a warm excitement I hadn't felt in years. But when he arrived, he wasn't alone. I heard the bikes before I saw them, engines roaring as they pulled up in our driveway, a little parade of raw metal and leather. 5 bikes, each one unique and loud, and there was Matt in the middle of them, grinning like he was walking onto a stage. He owned. My stomach flipped as I took them in, these ruffle-looking men with heavy boots, smirking and laughing as they dismounted their bikes, giving me the sort of once-over I hadn't felt in years. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. Matt had mentioned his friends, but I'd pictured college buddies or co-workers, not a biker crew straight out of a movie. Hey Ma, he called, his voice thick with a confidence that hadn't been there before. And he hugged me like he'd been gone a lot longer than a few years. You brought friends, I said, managing a polite smile, my mind racing as I sized them up. They were as different from Sam as a storm is from a gentle breeze, and it felt like they'd brought a whole world with them, one I didn't understand but couldn't tear my eyes from. Matt's friends introduced themselves with rough, casual grins. Nick, one of the taller guys, had tattoos running down both arm sleeves of ink that seemed to tell a story in pieces. He gave me a friendly nod, eyes lingering on mine a beat too long. There was a smaller, wiry guy named Jake with a quick smile and a faint scar across his jaw. One of them even called me Yam in that half-respectful, half-teasing way that made me want to laugh and roll my eyes at the same time. Their presence was intoxicating. Everything about them felt loud and alive, and when they looked at me, I felt like I was being seen again. Really seen. Sam pulled up in his truck not long after, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. He gave me a raised brow that seemed to ask if I'd lost my mind, and I could only shrug and laugh it off as if it were all some harmless surprise. He greeted Matt with a firm handshake, but there was a stiffness there, and I knew he wasn't thrilled. Matt's friends nodded politely to Sam, but there was a T I couldn't place, a sort of unspoken question hanging in the air, like they were each sizing each other up that night as they sat around the table talking and joking with Matt. Our house felt different. Charged. It wasn't the place of quiet dinners and predictable conversations anymore. It was like it had taken on a pulse. I felt it especially when Nick looked my way. Every once in a while he'd shoot me a quick grin or make a comment meant just for me. My cheeks would warm, and I'd feel ridiculous, like a schoolgirl all over again. But I Couldn't deny it, I liked it, Sam noticed. Of course, in that subtle way he'd give me a look every time I laughed a little too easily at one of their jokes. Or if I leaned in too closely, brushing Matt's shoulder or letting my hand rest a second too long on my wine glass. He didn't say anything, but I knew what he was thinking, and honestly I couldn't help but feel a small thrill in defying his sight. Disapproval after years of calm, expected quiet. It felt good to disrupt things a little. The following days settled into a rhythm, Matt's friends coming and going, filling the house with sounds that clashed with Sam's natural quiet. At first they'd stay in the garage working on their bikes, talking in low voices, their laughter sometimes spilling out into the yard. I'd steal glances out the window, watching them, captivated by how different they were from anything in my life. Sometimes when I'd go out to get something from the car or just check on them, they'd stop what they were doing, turning their attention toward me, a small smirk here, a nod there. Their eyes held a kind of curiosity, maybe even a touch of something else. It felt dangerous, forbidden, but it was also intoxicating. They'd offer a cigarette or joke about showing me how a real engine works, and I'd laugh, waving them off, but each time I stayed just a little longer. And while Sam would go off to work each morning, I was here with the guys, keeping my hands busy with housework, pretending I wasn't listening to them, just outside, feeling that magnetic pull. I'd glance at myself in the mirror before heading out, noticing details I hadn't cared about before: a smudge of mascara, a faint line around my eyes, my dresses once worn simply because they were comfortable now felt necessary, something I did for them even if I couldn't admit it to myself. I never said anything to Sam, and he never asked, but I could tell he was growing weary. He'd get home and take a long look around, as if he expected something to be a miss. Sometimes he'd come home a little earlier and I'd feel his eyes on me, watching the way I'd smooth my dress or linger a little too long when I stepped outside. I wasn't breaking any rules, I told myself. I was just living a little. There was no harm in that, right? But deep down I knew something was changing. I could feel it every time Nick caught my eye or one of the guys tossed me a compliment. I'd laugh it off, but there was a spark there that I hadn't felt in so long, a thrill that started to seep into my everyday life. It wasn't long before Sam started asking questions, little remarks that hinted at his discomfort. "There are here an awful lot," he'd say casually, though I could hear the edge in his voice. I'd shrug it off, telling him they were Matt's friends, that they needed a place to work on their bikes, a little space to unwind. He'd frowned but wouldn't push it. But every time I looked in the mirror, every time I felt that electric thrill pass over me, I knew something was shifting. I was playing with fire, drawn to a flame I didn't fully understand, but I couldn't help myself. For the first time in years I felt seen, alive in a way I'd forgotten I could be. I didn't know what it all meant yet, but I knew this: I was no longer the quiet, predictable wife. Something inside me had woken up, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to go back to sleep. When I think back on that summer, it feels like I'm watching someone else's life unfold. I see her, the woman who's lived safely, carefully, all her life, drawn towards something dangerous without even realizing she's already stepped over the line. After Matt and his friends moved in, our house changed in ways I hadn't expected. They spent the days working on bikes, their presence expanding from the garage to the yard to the kitchen to the very air they filled the rooms with. Their deep voices, their heavy laughter, that acrid mix of engine oil and cigarette smoke. I would wake up each morning with a flutter of anticipation, the kind I hadn't felt since I was young. Sam noticed, of course. He watched me, really watched me, in a way he hadn't in years. I think he was suspicious from the beginning. He'd come home and noticed the subtle changes, the way I lingered longer in front of the mirror, checking my reflection before heading out to grab something from the car or offering the Guys, a cold drink, and then there was Nick. Nick was different from the rest. He was quieter, his smile always carrying a hint of something else, something darker and deeply alluring. When he looked at me, he had a way of making me feel as if I were the only person in the room, even if there were 3 others laughing beside him. His tattoos ran down his arms in intricate patterns winding up toward his collar like some kind of armor, but it was his eyes that held me, the way they'd linger on me when he thought no one was watching, or how he'd give me a small, knowing smile that felt like a secret shared between us. One afternoon I brought out a pitcher of lemonade, the good kind, homemade with fresh lemons from the small tree in our yard. They were laughing over some story Matt was telling about a late-night ride, and as I poured the lemonade, Nick leaned in a little closer. Homemade lemonade, he asked, his voice low, a hint of a tease in his tone, a real home-cooked touch. I laughed, brushing it off, but I felt the warmth of his gaze. Well, you guys are guests after all. It's the least I can do. But the way he looked at me felt far from polite. It was as if he knew exactly why I made it just for them, why I'd lingered in the kitchen a little too long, tasting it and making sure it was just right. Nick didn't look away. He kept his eyes on me, and for a brief moment I felt like a girl again, flattered, excited, and nervous. It was the kind of look that reminded me of how it felt to be desired, something I hadn't experienced in years. But just as quickly I felt that familiar pang of guilt. I was a married woman. I had a husband, one who worked himself to the bone to provide for me, who trusted me. And here I was basking in the attention of another man like it was some kind of lifeline. That evening, as the sun started to dip, I watched Sam sit across from Matt in the living room, asking about his plans, how long he intended to stay. I could tell Sam was uncomfortable, but he was doing his best to be supportive. I sat beside them, pretending to be absorbed in a magazine, but all I could hear was Matt, his relaxed tone, almost taunting, as he reassured Sam, saying, "I'm not in a rush, Dad, you know I need a place to figure things out." Sam just nodded, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming against the arm of the chair. When Matt's friends came in, Sam's posture stiffened even more. They sprawled out across the couches, their boots resting on our coffee table like they owned the place. Nick settled next to me, his arms stretching out casually along the back of the couch, not quite touching me, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. Samsha *T me a look, his brows furrowed, and I quickly shifted forward, picking up the magazine and pretending to be deeply engrossed. Later that night, when we were getting ready for bed, Sam finally spoke up. "They hear an awful lot," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Don't you think they could find another place to work on their bikes?" I kept my voice light, trying to keep the tension from rising. "There, Matt's friends, Sam, they're not hurting anyone. It's just for a while," he sighed, running a hand through his hair, his frustration showing through. "It's just they're not like the people we usually have around here, and they're always here. I don't know, it just doesn't feel right." He looked at me, his expression searching, as if he were trying to read something deeper beneath my words. I laughed it off, saying he was being paranoid. But his words lingered. I found myself questioning why I was so eager to defend them, why I was so invested in keeping things as they were. Part of me wanted to push them away, to pretend that this wasn't happening. But another part, the part that felt alive, that felt like it had been pulled from a deep sleep, wanted them to stay. One evening, as the guys were gathered around the bikes again, I headed to the garage with a tray of cold beers. The laughter and rocket, this chatter grew louder. I felt my heartbeat quicken with each step, a strange mixture of excitement and guilt rushing through me. The air was thick and hazy in the garage, smelling of sweat, motor oil, and cigarette smoke. They glanced up as I entered, grins spreading across their faces when they saw me. The looks they gave me were different tonight, bold, lingering. It felt like the lines between Us had blurred the air thick with a tension I couldn't ignore. Nick reached, overtaking one of the beers from the tray, his fingers brushing mine. You really are spoiling us, you know that he said, a lazy smirk tugging at his lips. I laughed it off, but my voice sounded foreign to me, breathier, more uncertain. The other men joined in, thanking me in that same teasing way, their eyes following my every move. There was something in the way they looked at me tonight, a kind of focus that felt impossible to escape. The garage was buzzing with a low hum of heat, and I could feel my pulse thrumming in my neck, faster than I wanted it to be. The tray trembled slightly in my hands as I set it down, and before I could pull away, Nick reached for me, tugging me closer with an easy, practiced grip. The look in his eyes was magnetic, inviting, and the laughter from the others grew softer, almost encouraging. I felt myself lean in as if drawn by some unseen force, my breath catching in my throat as I locked eyes with him. What are you doing? I managed to murmur, but the words came out weak, betraying me. He didn't answer, just gave me that slow, dangerous smile, and then his hand was on my waist, his fingers pressing lightly but firmly, and I felt myself sinking into him, my resistance dissolving in the heat of that moment. The others moved closer, their presence surrounding me, each one looking at me in that same daring way. I glanced around, feeling a wild thrill run through me, something reckless and urgent. There was no hesitation left, no more pretending. The choice was mine, and it felt like the only one I could make. One by one they closed in their hands, and voices filling the space around me, turning the room into something hot, dark, and breathless. Every thought of Sam faded, replaced by something raw, something unrestrained, something I had buried inside myself for years. And as the night unraveled, I found myself swept up in a feverish, dangerous that I knew I could never take back. The garage was filled with laughter and murmurs, the haze of cigarette smoke and the low rumble of music vibrating through the air. I was lost in the moment, every sense heightened, feeling both bold and terrified by what I'd done. My mind was a whirl of heat, guilt, and reckless abandon. Everything I had kept locked away for years unleashed in the span of hours. Just as I was about to catch my breath, still surrounded by the guy murmuring laughter, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of Sam's truck pulling into the driveway. My heart dropped. In the dim light I saw his silhouette through the garage window, standing there frozen. He was looking at me, at us, his face unreadable in the darkness. For a second the world seemed to stand still, the laughter fading as the weight of the situation crashed down around me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone waking from a nightmare only to realize it was all too real. Sam, I started, my voice weak, barely above a whisper, but before I could say anything more he was moving toward me, his face twisted with an intensity I'd never seen before. In one terrifying moment he lunged, his fury erupting in a way that left me breathless, his fist connected with the wall beside me, shaking the entire garage, his breath coming in sharp, heavy gasps. I backed away, tripping over the toolbox, desperately trying to explain, to find words that might somehow make sense of the mess I'd made. You dare bring this into my home? His voice was low, trembling with rage, his eyes locked on me with a look that could have burned through steel. Before I could respond he moved closer, the other guys falling silent, stepping back, suddenly realizing the gravity of what was unfolding. I could see in his eyes that any explanation, any excuse was pointless. He'd already seen enough. He was seething, his entire body rigid, hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, and in that moment I knew I'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He reached for me, his grip rough and unyielding as he pulled me forward, his voice a low, furious growl. How could you here in our home, our home? Do you understand? His face was inches from mine, his eyes wild, barely containing his fury. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words lodged in my throat, choked by shame and fear. Then as quickly as he pulled me close, he shoved me back, the force knocking me pain-sure *T through my side, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight of his anger. He turned to leave, but before he did, he glared back at me, his eyes dark with something far worse than fury, contempt. You're nothing to me now, he spat, his voice cutting through me like a blade. The days that followed were a blur of shock and despair. Sam didn't just leave me to my shame, he dismantled everything that bound me to the life we built. He tore through the house, shattering picture frames, ripping up letters, leaving me with nothing but the cold emptiness of a life destroyed. Every room became a testament to his anger, to the things I had broken, and with each smashed memory I felt the world slipping further away. He didn't speak to me except in clipped, icy commands, his words stripped of any warmth or affection. I tried reaching out, begging him to understand, but he was unreachable, his silence echoing louder than any words. And soon the reality of what I'd done settled in like a shadow, haunting me, leaving me to face the ruins of my choices alone. It was a week later, in the midst of that silence, that I noticed the first signs. I brushed it off at first, it up to stress, but then the nausea came, persistent and undeniable. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I stared at the little test in my hand, watching the second line appear clear as day. I was pregnant. My mind reeled 1,000 questions flooding in all at once. Was it Sam's? Surely it had to be, but even the smallest seed of doubt grew into a gnawing fear, one I could barely bring myself to face. I was terrified both of what this meant and of how Sam would react. He was already looking at me like a stranger, like someone he couldn't bear to be around. How could I tell him this? But I knew I had to. That evening I waited for him in the kitchen, rehearsing my words, hoping, praying he'd understand. When he finally came in, his face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by the weight of everything that had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to speak, even as the words caught in my throat. Sam, I'm pregnant. For a moment his expression didn't change. He just stared at me as if he hadn't heard me at all. Then his face twisted, a bitter smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. You're pregnant, he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. Yes, and it's yours, Sam, I swear. It's yours. He let out a hard laugh, shaking his head. Do you really expect me to believe that after everything I felt? Tears sting my eyes, but I held his gaze, willing him to believe me. Please, Sam, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but this baby, it's ours. I know it. He looked at me for a long cold moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he would understand, but then he turned away, his voice flat and final. I don't care whose it is, I want you out. I sank to the floor, my mind spinning, the weight of his words crushing me. I had never felt so completely alone. I begged him, pleaded with him to reconsider, for the sake of the child, for the sake of the life we'd once shared. But his mind was set. He filed for divorce the next day, cutting me off from the life we'd built, leaving me with nothing but a broken home and the remnants of a love I'd taken for granted. In the weeks that followed, I wandered through life in a daze, carrying the child I had once longed for, but now felt like a reminder of everything I'd lost. I reached out to Sam repeatedly, leaving messages, letters, anything to try and bridge the gap between us, to explain, to somehow make things right. But every call went unanswered, and every letter remained unread, left on his doorstep like discarded memories. And when the baby came, a beautiful boy with Sam's eyes and my smile, I felt a flicker of hope, a desperate wish that he would come back, that he'd want to know his son, to see the PCE of us that still existed in this child. But there was only silence, no message, no visit, just the empty reminder of a life that had slipped through my fingers. I spent countless nights holding my son, rocking him in the quiet darkness, wondering if Sam would ever want to meet Him if he'd ever forgive me, but as the days passed the reality became clear. My choices had carved a wound too deep to heal a rift that would forever separate us, and so I learned to live in the shadow of my decisions, haunted by the memories of what once was and the family I had shattered for a fleeting thrill. Every day I looked at my son and saw Sam's face, a bittersweet reminder of the love I'd lost and the life that could have been. Time has a way of blurring things, softening edges until memories seem almost dream-like, but some things remain sharp, cutting reminders of choices that can't be undone. I moved through life like a ghost in the months after Sam's departure, wandering through empty rooms and whole days with only my son's quiet presence to ground me. He was my lifeline, my reason to get up each morning, even as the reality of my choices weighed down on me like a constant shadow. At night I would sit by his crib, rocking him gently, tracing his tiny features as he slept. In the curve of his smile I saw echoes of Sam, faint but unmistakable. I would think about the life we'd once shared, the quiet moments and comfortable routines, and it would hit me all over again, the gnawing guilt, the painful realization of how I had destroyed it all for nothing. The thrill I chased, that fleeting, intoxicating rush, now felt empty and hollow, a spark that had burned up far too quickly, leaving nothing but ash and regret in its wake. The hardest part was knowing that Sam was out there, close yet unreachable, deliberately keeping his distance. I tried everything to reach him. I left him messages, sent photos of our son, letters filled with promises of change and desperate pleas to reconsider, but he didn't respond. Each attempt met only with silence. The more time passed, the more I realized that he was gone for good, that the love I had taken for granted had withered under the weight of my betrayal. Every day I clung to the hope that he would come around, that he'd want to be a part of his son's life. If not mine, I wanted my son to know his father, to have the love and guidance that only Sam could provide. But the calls never came. There was no knock at the door, no sign of Sam wanting to look back. It was a silence that grew louder with each passing day, a void that I knew I'd created and could never fill. With each month the finality of it all sank and deeper, and I started to see my life for what it had become, haunted by the shadows of what could have been. There were nights when I'd sit alone, replaying every choice, every missed moment, wondering how I'd been so blind, so reckless. In the quiet I could see it all clearly, the love I had shared with Sam, the stability I'd thrown away, the trust I'd shattered, and for what a thrill that had faded as quickly as it had come, leaving me with nothing but shattered pieces and a son who would grow up without his father. People move on, that's what they say, but I felt trapped, living in the echoes of my mistakes. My life now felt like a series of empty routines, echoes of what we'd once shared as a family, hollowed out by my own hand. I tried to find meaning, purpose, to be the best mother I could be for my son, but the specter of my choices hung over me like a shadow that wouldn't fade. And so day by day I learned to live with the silence, to carry the weight of my regrets alone. In the end all I could do was hold my son a little closer, hoping to give him a love that might one day make up for what I had taken away. But as the years stretched on, the truth settled in. Some rifts can never be healed, some choices are final, and the life I had lost, the family I had destroyed, would remain forever out of reach, a haunting reminder of what might have been.